Nicholas Brady didn't choose his home because it was convenient. He didn't care about the local amenities, the school ratings, or the golf club down the road. He chose it for the distance. The land sat on the outer edge of a half-organized neighborhood that once aimed to be an upscale enclave, but ended up a patchwork of modest independence and misplaced regulation. There were no sidewalks on his stretch, no manicured hedges, just gravel, weeds, and trees that still grew the way they wanted. It was, as Nicholas liked to say, just far enough out that no one can pretend they got here by mistake. The house itself wasn't a house in the conventional sense. It was a reclaimed structure, what used to be an old forestry shed, reinforced and expanded into a spacious loft that he designed and rebuilt with his own hands. Heavy timber beams stretched across the ceiling like the bones of something ancient and defiant. It wasn't flashy or modern. It had weight, age, and personality. People either found it offensive or fascinating. Nicholas preferred that. He never wanted to blend in. At 59, Nicholas lived alone and liked it that way. He wasn't a recluse, but he also wasn't the neighbor who waved at passing cars or organized block parties. He ran a custom wood shop that had grown in reputation beyond what he ever expected. Orders came in steady, mostly through word of mouth and a few YouTube videos of him quietly working. No music, no narration, just tools and sawdust. The kind of content that drew in men who liked precision and patience, and women who liked watching someone build something real with their hands. He wasn't interested in going viral. He didn't care about the numbers. But the orders kept coming, and that meant he could keep the gate shut and the shop running. There was only one constant in his home outside of his work: Barlo. The dog had come into Nicholas's life 6 years earlier, abandoned as a puppy with an infected leg and a bad limp. The vet had said the odds weren't good. Nicholas had said, "Try anyway." Barlo recovered, slower than most, but with the kind of stubborn strength Nicholas respected. Big, quiet, loyal, with that silent awareness some animals have that feels more like a pact than a pet. Barlo didn't bark unless there was something worth barking at. He didn't chase after things for no reason, and he never crossed the boundary of the yard unless Nicholas did first. People said you couldn't train dogs like that anymore. Nicholas hadn't trained him. He just treated him like he mattered. The neighborhood, if you could call it that, was policed by a small self-appointed group of residents who liked to think of themselves as a board, but operated more like a clique. There were no official contracts, no dues Nicholas had ever signed. But the further the city expanded, the more these groups tried to enforce community standards. At the head of it all was Karen Ellington, a retired literature teacher with the posture of a general and the moral flexibility of a politician. She lived 3 lots down in a pristine 2-story colonial with artificial grass, white gravel beds, and a flag that changed seasonally. She had a reputation for showing up at people's doors with laminated notices about mailbox height, lawn coloration, and the optical harmony of home exteriors. Nicholas, of course, had no mailbox. His mail was delivered to a lockbox on a steel post he installed at the end of the road. His house had no siding, just weathered vertical planks and reinforced steel panels where he kept materials secure. He painted nothing, landscaped nothing, and mowed only the parts of the yard where Barlo liked to sleep. This alone was enough to earn him passive-aggressive flyers and letters tucked into the cracks of his front gate. He ignored them all, but Karen didn't. Ignoring her was like poking a nest of bees and then daring them to sting. The first time she came in person was the summer before last. She stood at the gate in a flowery blouse, sunglasses that covered half her face, and a clipboard like a badge of authority. She pressed the call button 4 times before Nicholas answered through the speaker. "I just wanted to make you aware," she said with the artificial sweetness of someone about to draw blood, "that your property violates 5, possibly 6, of the neighborhood appearance guidelines. We've received several complaints." Nicholas didn't respond. The silence stretched long enough for her to clear her throat. "I'd be happy to provide a copy of the regulations for your review," she continued. "We're really trying to keep this community looking." "You're on private land," Nicholas interrupted, his voice low and flat. "Move along." That was it. The gate didn't open. The camera clicked once, capturing the image of her standing in place like someone told to freeze during a bank robbery. She walked away stiffly, and for a while, the visits stopped. But the energy didn't. Letters kept arriving. The notes got more pointed. And when those didn't work, she started showing up with others, bringing men from the committee, hinting that Nicholas was setting a dangerous example by refusing to cooperate. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone crossed a line. These weren't the types who let go. They wore civility like skin, but underneath it was all pressure and control. The kind of people who smiled at funerals and filed noise complaints when they didn't like your music. Nicholas wasn't scared, but he wasn't stupid either. People like Karen didn't start with violence. They started with legality, with whispers, with enough pressure to make you trip over your own reactions. The trick was not to react at all until the moment called for it. But when it did, you'd better not hesitate. The last straw didn't come with a notice. It came in blood. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon, heat pressing down on everything like a held breath. Nicholas had been in the shop all day, working on a custom wine cabinet when Barlo let out a sound he hadn't heard before. Not a bark. A strangled yelp that sounded halfway between pain and panic. Nicholas dropped his chisel, bolted through the side door, and found Barlo dragging himself across the gravel, one leg soaked red. The fur around his shoulder had been slashed clean through, an angled, deliberate cut. Too deep for barbed wire, too clean for a stick. Nicholas knelt without a word, wrapped the wound, lifted the 80-pound dog into his truck, and drove to the emergency vet 2 towns over. Barlo didn't whine. He just looked at him with that same calm trust as if to say, "You saw it. You know." By the time they returned home, Nicholas had already made 3 decisions. First, he was going to find out what exactly happened. Second, he was going to make sure it never happened again. And third, if anyone stepped foot on his land again, they weren't leaving the same way they came in. He stood at the gate in the moonlight that night, his hands resting on the cold steel. The wind was still, the trees didn't move, and for the first time in a long time, Nicholas Brady whispered something out loud. "They picked the wrong damn fence to jump." The morning after the attack on Barlo was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. There were no birds, no wind. The usual rhythm of insects, rustling leaves, even the distant hum of cars on the highway seemed absent, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Nicholas woke early, his body aching not from age or work, but from the hard coil of tension that had wrapped around his spine during the sleepless night. Barlo lay on the floor near the couch, heavily sedated, his wound stitched and wrapped with a layer of gauze that already bore spots of red. The vet had said the cut was clean, too precise to be accidental. Someone had used a tool, something like a hook or blade, aimed and swung with intention. Nicholas had nodded silently, but inside, something shifted. Something old and cold that had been buried under years of patient detachment. He walked the property before the sun crested the trees, moving with the slow deliberation of someone looking for more than just answers. He was looking for a reason. The break in the fence wasn't obvious at first. The eastern boundary of his lot sloped into a shallow ravine lined with thick underbrush and scrub trees. It wasn't a place people wandered, not unless they had a reason. But halfway down, just beyond the first crest, Nicholas found a section where the wire had been cut, not torn, the ends clipped and twisted back into the grass. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. No ragged edges, no struggle. Clean entry, clean exit. A few feet beyond that, he spotted something glinting in the light. Half buried in the dirt was a garden hook, the kind used to hang flower pots or lanterns. The tip was bent inward, jagged, and stained dark. Nicholas picked it up with a gloved hand, examined the edge, then wrapped it in a shop rag and tucked it into his back pocket. He didn't touch the disturbed grass, didn't mask the footprint impressions he found leading back up the slope. He made sure the gate camera had full storage, then headed inside to make the call. The deputy who answered the phone sounded young, indifferent. Nicholas gave his name, address, and a summary of what had happened. There was a pause, followed by the standard script. Was the dog okay? Did he know who did it? Had there been any prior threats? Was there property damage? Nicholas answered plainly, giving only what was necessary, careful to keep his tone even. "We'll send someone by," the deputy said. "Might be a while. Got a car off the road out in the West Valley." Nicholas didn't argue. He knew what that meant. Low priority. A man and his dog, one wound, no witnesses. It didn't matter. Not unless he made it matter. The deputy arrived an hour before dusk. A woman in her early 30s, uniform too crisp, badge too shiny. She was polite but distracted, eyes scanning the house like she was checking off a box. Nicholas showed her the tool, the fence, the prints, the camera. She squatted near the broken section of fence, frowning. "No signs of a struggle," she said. "You didn't touch any of this?" "I'm not stupid," Nicholas said flatly. "You gonna run the prints on the hook?" She looked at the wrapped tool and shrugged. "It's not protocol unless we open a formal investigation. Right now, it's an animal injury. You'd need to file a separate report, probably through animal control." Nicholas said nothing for a moment, just watched the way she looked at him, like someone cataloging a nuisance. "Who do you think did it?" she asked finally. "I don't guess," he replied, "but I know who had a reason." She nodded like that was good enough, took a few photos, wrote something in a small notebook that looked more decorative than official, then handed him a card. "If anything changes, or if someone comes back, call it in. But off the record—" She paused, lowering her voice like they were in on something together. "Maybe keep your dog closer to the house for a while. You know how people are with big dogs." Nicholas took the card, nodded once, and walked her back to the gate. He watched her drive away without turning around. The moment her cruiser disappeared around the bend, he went to the workshop. He didn't own a security system in the traditional sense. No blinking alarms or monthly fees. What he had was better. During the early years of building his business, Nicholas had worked closely with a small electronics supplier who specialized in self-contained surveillance systems, military surplus modified for civilian use. Off-grid, high resolution, low power. He'd only used them once, when a client tried to backcharge an order and claim non-delivery. The footage had shut that down in 20 seconds. He still had the equipment, packed away in a steel cabinet behind his radial saw. By the time the sun disappeared, he had 4 motion sensors deployed. 2 on the east ridge, 1 near the shop, and 1 at the gate. Each was rigged to a backup battery and a program to ping his phone directly. No cloud, no Wi-Fi. Local storage only. He wasn't interested in broadcasting anything. He just wanted to see. That night, Barlo stirred in his sleep, legs twitching from medication dreams. Nicholas sat beside him with a notebook open, listing out what he knew and what he suspected. He didn't want to play detective. He wasn't wired for drama or theory. He liked facts, cause and effect, pressure and response. And the fact was, someone had entered his land with a weapon and left his dog bleeding. That wasn't a disagreement. That wasn't some neighborhood dispute. That was an act of violence. By the end of the week, the response came, but not how he expected. It wasn't a knock at the door or a visit in the night. It was a letter, delivered by hand and placed directly into his lockbox. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, sealed with a printed emblem that mimicked officiality but bore no legal standing. No return address. Inside was a single page, typed in neat language, warning him of an aggressive animal incident reported by an unnamed neighbor. The letter cited community standards, implied fines, and suggested that the dog, if seen off leash, would be subject to removal for the safety of others. Nicholas read the letter twice, then slowly folded it and placed it beside the bent garden hook. On his kitchen table, he didn't respond. He didn't call. Instead, he printed out a fresh property survey from the county website, marked the boundary lines in red ink, laminated a copy, and mounted it beside his gate. Then he installed a sign just below it, small and simple. Private land. Entry without consent is trespassing. No threats, no bravado. Just a fact. Barlo was healing. The stitches held. But his behavior had changed. More watchful, more reactive. He paced the house at night. He growled at the wind. He refused to sleep in his usual spot by the back door and now lay directly beneath Nicholas's workbench during the day. On the fourth morning, Nicholas found something odd at the edge of the property. A patch of overturned soil just beneath the old cedar stump that marked the corner line. Someone had dug there recently. No tools left behind, no obvious object missing. But the dirt was fresh, and the boot prints were smaller than his. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the disturbed ground, then reached for his phone and tapped one number, the one contact he hadn't used in years. "Yeah," the voice answered after one ring. "What happened?" Nicholas looked back toward the house, his expression unreadable. "I think someone wants a war," he said. "But they don't know how to start one right." And now he intended to show them how. Nicholas had never considered himself a paranoid man. Cautious, yes. Precise, absolutely. But not fearful. He didn't have time for fear, and frankly, he didn't see the utility in it. Fear, like sentiment, had a way of blurring the edges of a problem that required sharpness. But as the days passed and the quiet hostility around him began to show signs of evolving into something far less subtle, even he had to admit that whatever this was, it was no longer a petty neighborhood dispute. It was a campaign, deliberate, methodical, and escalating. It began subtly, as most things in his world did. The first sign came not with a scream or a knock, but with absence. The kind of silence that only becomes apparent when something is missing. One of his boundary markers, a heavy iron stake driven 2 feet into the earth and painted with reflective orange tape, was gone. Not knocked over, not broken, gone. Dug out, cleanly removed, the soil around it tamped flat like someone had tried to erase its existence. Nicholas didn't panic. He simply measured the distance from the remaining markers, confirmed that his property line hadn't moved an inch, then went to his garage and welded a new one. Thicker, heavier, anchored in concrete. The next day, another marker vanished. The pattern wasn't random. Whoever was behind this was testing him. Not just his patience, but his response time, his tolerance, and perhaps even his willingness to bend. But Nicholas Brady didn't bend. He adapted. He studied. And when necessary, he retaliated. He began conducting nightly perimeter walks, slow circuits around the property with Barlo limping loyally at his side. The dog had grown increasingly alert, his ears twitching at shadows, his nose constantly lifted, scanning the air like a radar dish. Whatever sedation remained from the injury was gone now, burned out by a need to protect. Nicholas trusted Barlo's instincts more than any sensor or camera. And when, 3 nights in a row, the dog stopped in the exact same spot by the northeast fence, growling low at the dark, Nicholas knew someone was watching. The very next day, he took a trip into town, not for groceries, not for tools, but for an envelope, specifically a manila one, thick and unmarked, which he handed quietly to a local process server who owed him a favor from years back. Inside was everything he'd documented so far: photos, timestamps, a printout of the community letter, and an affidavit he'd signed, outlining the injury to Barlo and the timeline of events. He didn't want the police involved just yet, but he wanted the option. The document was to be delivered to a civil attorney if anything happened to him, his dog, or his property. Not paranoia. Insurance. When he returned home, there was a folded flyer stuck to his front gate with blue painter's tape. It was brightly colored, printed on glossy paper, and bore the seal of what Karen Ellington had once smugly referred to as the Community Preservation Alliance. The headline read, "Keep our neighborhood safe. Report unsafe structures and animals." Below was a bullet list of complaints citizens could file: unlicensed renovations, aggressive dogs, unauthorized landscaping, noise disturbances, visible hoarding, and more. At the bottom, in fine print, was a QR code and a local number. No names, no accountability. Nicholas didn't tear it down. He didn't touch it at all. Instead, he took a photo, then carefully removed the tape, folded the paper without a crease, and added it to his file. That evening, he reinforced the gate, welded an additional brace behind the hinge. Then, he added a pressure sensor inside the dirt at the threshold. Nothing fancy, just a buried plate tied to an analog alert system inside the shop. If anyone stepped there with enough weight, he'd know. Not just from a camera, from the distinct mechanical buzz that would sound from a repurposed alarm bell wired straight into his workbench. 2 days passed without incident. Then came the trash. Nicholas stepped out one morning to find his garbage cans overturned. Not kicked, not toppled, but systematically dumped, recyclables and all, across the gravel in a spread that looked less like a mess and more like a dissection. Bottles arranged by color, metal in one pile, shredded paper in another. It wasn't vandalism, it was theater. A message that someone had been close enough long enough to sort through his waste without fear of interruption. He didn't clean it up right away. He took photos again, logged the time, then, calmly and methodically, gathered the debris and placed it into thick contractor bags, which he then stored inside his garage. Not because he needed them, but because whoever did this might. Later that same day, as the sun began to fall behind the tree line, he received an envelope by certified mail. The courier didn't speak, just handed over the clipboard with the signature line and walked off like he couldn't leave fast enough. Inside the envelope was a copy of a formal complaint, an official document, stamped and notarized, filed through the county clerk's office. Karen Ellington was suing him. The language was flowery, but the accusation was clear. She claimed that part of Nicholas's property, specifically the northeast corner where he kept his wood-drying stacks, was unlawfully encroaching onto community land that had historically been public. She claimed that the fence was in violation of sightline regulations and that his dog posed an ongoing and credible threat to pedestrian safety. Attached were 3 photos, one of the fence line, one of the stack of wood, and one of Barlo standing beside the gate, his head tilted slightly like he was curious. Nicholas stared at the images, then leaned back in his chair and let out a slow, humorless laugh. She had someone taking pictures. That meant they'd been on his land. Again. He didn't call her. He didn't call the number listed for her legal representative. He called Alice McKenna, a property attorney who had once helped him win a zoning battle against a corporate developer. She wasn't cheap, but she was surgical. "Tell me everything," she said without preamble, and Nicholas did. By the time he finished, she'd already pulled the tax maps and confirmed that the land in question had never been public, hadn't even been accessible by foot legally in over a decade. "You're going to need more than defense," she said. "You need to get offensive. Countersuit, trespassing, harassment, false claim. You've got a paper trail?" "I've got a damn book," he replied. "Good," she said. "We'll bury her in it." Nicholas hung up the phone, feeling no relief, only clarity. This was no longer about territory. It wasn't about aesthetics or community. It was personal. Karen didn't want compromise. She wanted submission. She wanted to break the man who wouldn't answer her clipboard. That night, Nicholas left the porch light off and waited in the dark. Just before midnight, the sensor tripped. A soft buzz inside the shop. He didn't jump, didn't flinch. He moved. Quiet. focused. He walked the length of the house with Barlo limping silently at his heel, reached the gate, stayed in the shadow, and watched. Karen was there, alone, in boots and a black coat, face obscured by a scarf. She climbed the outer post like she'd done it before. No hesitation, no pause. She straddled the top, then dropped into the yard with a grunt. She moved toward the drying stack, something in her hand. A canister. Metal. Round. He didn't wait to find out. Nicholas stepped forward, rifle in hand. He didn't raise it, didn't point it, but he chambered a round, the distinct sound echoing across the yard like a crack of truth. Karen froze. Her body stiffened, then turned. She saw him. She saw Barlo, teeth bared, beside him. She didn't scream, not at first. She dropped the canister, it rolled into the grass, and held up both hands. "This isn't what it looks like," she said, voice high, false calm. "It looks like trespassing," Nicholas said. "I was looking for a lost cat," she lied. "In a locked yard, at midnight, with chemicals? It's deterrent." He barked at me. "He's sedated, you lunatic." Karen backed up. Barlo growled. "Go," Nicholas said. "Now." She turned, tripped, fell onto her hands and knees, crawled, then scrambled up the post like a rat chased by fire. She disappeared into the dark without another word. Nicholas didn't follow. He waited, then picked up the canister. Pepper spray, industrial grade. He smiled. The cameras had it all. This time, she wasn't getting away with it. The next morning brought no apologies, no frantic visits, no neighbors inquiring about what they might have heard the night before. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the only sound on Nicholas's land was the steady crunch of gravel under his boots as he made his first round at dawn. The overturned canister still lay where he'd dropped it after inspecting it under proper light. Pepper-based, designed for use against large animals, but with additives known to cause long-term skin irritation. Illegal in several states without a commercial license. A perfect tool for someone trying to hurt without leaving a trace that screamed intent to maim. Nicholas had already placed it in a sealed evidence bag. He didn't bother to clean the prints. He wanted them untouched, documented, measured. Alice called just after 8, already 2 steps ahead of him. Her voice was calm, but clipped, efficient and focused, the way it always was when something real began to take shape in a case. She had reviewed the footage from the previous night, and she didn't mince words. "You could have shot her," she said, "and you would have been legally in the clear." "I wasn't about to start that war," Nicholas replied. "Good," she said, "because now we start one you can win." She had already filed a restraining order request with the county court, naming Karen as a direct threat to personal safety, property integrity, and animal welfare. Accompanying it was an official affidavit, sworn and signed by Nicholas, and footage from 3 cameras covering the entry, the trespass, and the physical evidence in her hand. Alice had also compiled every document Nicholas had sent her. Maps, photos, timestamps, the certified letter from the week before, and the original injury report from Barlo's vet, which clearly stated that the wound was consistent with an intentional strike from a blunt or edged tool. "This isn't just neighbor drama," she told him. "It's targeted harassment, and now we have a clear escalation. We're not playing defense anymore." Nicholas hung up with a sense of grim satisfaction. But beneath it was something deeper, something colder. This wasn't victory, it was only confirmation. Confirmation that he had been right to trust his instincts, that his caution hadn't been paranoia, and that everything he'd feared Karen was capable of, she had now proven herself willing to do. Still, he wasn't prepared for what came next. 2 days later, a meeting was called by what remained of the community board, an emergency session, announced via mass texts and door-to-door notices taped to mailboxes. Nicholas received his copy shoved beneath his gate, neatly folded, without any identifying sender. It read like a formal HOA agenda, though everyone knew there was no active homeowners association recognized by law. The paper named a temporary location, the community park, and listed the topics to be discussed: recent safety incidents, boundary clarifications, and unaddressed nuisance complaints. The language was vague, bureaucratic, but the intent was transparent. This was a public trial. Karen wanted to paint herself as the victim before the neighborhood turned against her. Nicholas didn't want to go, but Alice insisted. "You have to show your face," she said. "Not as a statement, as a witness. Let them see you, calm, unshaken. That's how you take the oxygen out of her fire." And so he went. The park was nearly empty at first, just a few scattered folding chairs beneath the skeletal frame of an open-air pavilion. Karen was there already, of course, in a pressed navy coat and soft makeup, playing the role of composed concern. A man stood beside her, tall, polished, with the expression of someone trying very hard not to look like a lawyer. He wasn't introduced. Neighbors trickled in slowly. Some greeted Karen. Fewer acknowledged Nicholas. Most just sat in silence, waiting, unsure which way the wind was blowing. Karen opened with a tremble in her voice and a smile that never touched her eyes. She spoke of trauma, of feeling unsafe in her own neighborhood, and of an atmosphere of escalating aggression. She mentioned her attempts to mediate through formal complaint channels and address concerns directly. She even claimed that she had approached Nicholas out of concern for the dog's health, worried that it was being kept in cruel conditions. The pepper spray incident? A fabrication. She insisted she had been trying to return a lost cat that had darted into his yard and that he had met her with a firearm. Nicholas listened in silence. Then it was his turn. He spoke plainly, quietly. No theatrics, no insults, just facts. He described the injury to Barlo, the stolen survey markers, the threatening flyer, the complaint filed in bad faith, and then, methodically, he explained the footage, where it came from, how it was stored, what it showed. He didn't show it now. He simply stated that it existed, that it had been submitted to legal counsel, and that anyone disputing its content would have the opportunity to do so under penalty of perjury. The crowd shifted. People glanced at one another. Some leaned forward. Others leaned back. The man beside Karen whispered something to her. Karen's face twitched. She tried to speak again, to pivot, to inject doubt. Let's not escalate further. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, a heat-of-the-moment kind of thing. But her voice didn't carry anymore. The authority she'd walked in with had eroded, not because Nicholas shouted, but because he hadn't needed to. Alice's timing was perfect. As the meeting dragged toward its awkward close, Nicholas's phone buzzed. A single-line message: "Judge signed the order." It was over, at least in terms of legal leverage, but Nicholas knew better than to expect retreat. People like Karen didn't stop when they lost. They shifted. They looked for new terrain to corrupt, new methods, new proxies. They adapted, not out of intelligence, but out of an addict's need for control. And sure enough, that evening, a call came from an unknown number. When Nicholas answered, the voice was unfamiliar. Masculine, smooth, practiced, not local. The caller claimed to be from a private neighborhood oversight group, contracted to perform an audit of recent construction and landscaping changes in the area. He wanted to schedule a walkthrough of Nicholas's property to ensure compliance with safety standards. He used words like voluntary inspection, community reassurance, and mutual understanding. Nicholas let him speak, then asked one question. "Is Karen paying you, or are you just doing her bidding for free?" The silence that followed was pure. Then the line went dead. Nicholas turned off the porch light, locked the gate, and sat with Barlo on the steps as the wind picked up and the air turned cold. He didn't speak, didn't move, just waited, because he knew now with absolute certainty that the storm wasn't coming. It was already here. By the end of that week, the energy in the air had shifted again, but this time it wasn't the kind of change you could attribute to weather or nerves. It had weight. It had rhythm. Nicholas could feel it in the tension of Barlo's body as they walked the yard, in the way the shadows around his property seemed to fall differently, heavier, as if the light itself was being watched. The attempts to make him feel like a danger to the neighborhood had failed, publicly, legally, and with minimal damage to his reputation. But what Karen lost in credibility, she would try to recover in volume. And noise, Nicholas knew, didn't always come through voices. Sometimes it came through pressure, through corners and bureaucracies, through indirect hands that did the work of cowards under the veil of official language. The first sign came in the form of paperwork. A thick envelope, hand-delivered, no return address but bearing a seal from the county. Inside was a notice. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint regarding unauthorized structural modifications to his property. The language was sterile, overly formal, but it carried the unmistakable scent of someone attempting to weaponize procedure. The complaint listed specific violations: unauthorized fencing material, possible zoning violations related to detached utility structures, and even an accusation of unsafe worksite conditions based on an old pile of stacked timber near his shop. Wood that had been there for years, neatly organized, never once cited. Nicholas wasn't surprised. He was annoyed, but not surprised. He brought the packet to Alice the next morning. She flipped through it with a sigh, her fingers moving briskly from page to page. "Classic redirect," she muttered. She couldn't win on narrative, so now she's digging through the system trying to find a crack in your foundation, figuratively and literally. Nicholas raised an eyebrow. Can she get traction? She can get attention, Alice replied. Which means we'll have to waste our time proving what shouldn't need proving. But no, there's nothing here that holds up if you keep your records tight and stay a step ahead. And that's exactly what he did. Nicholas spent the next 3 days cataloging everything. Permit numbers, receipts, inspection records from the original build-out, and photographs time-stamped and logged. He printed copies, laminated the most critical documents, and kept the originals in a locked firebox inside his workshop. When the county inspector finally did show up, middle-aged, tired-looking, polite but methodical, Nicholas greeted him without hostility, offered black coffee, and led him through the grounds like a foreman walking a new hire through a job site. The inspector asked questions. Nicholas answered without embellishment. He let the facts speak. After 2 hours, the inspector gave a slow nod and said, "Off the record, I've seen this play before. Someone with too much time and not enough humility." Nicholas didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just nodded, handed the man a final folder, and saw him to the gate. But it didn't end there. That night, Barlo wouldn't leave the front step. He sat, alert, staring out into the tree line with an intensity Nicholas hadn't seen in him since the incident with the fence. Something had changed. The stillness wasn't still. It was a held breath. And Nicholas, trusting the dog more than his own sense of calm, walked the perimeter again, this time with a high-powered flashlight and the rifle strapped across his back. He found nothing. No prints, no torn brush, no obvious tampering. But when he returned to the shop, the lock on his tool shed was open. Not broken, not picked, just open. The door slightly ajar, the padlock hanging loosely in the hasp. Nothing appeared missing, nothing out of place. But Nicholas knew better. This was a message. Someone had been close enough to touch what mattered to him, and they wanted him to know they could do it again. He installed a new deadbolt that night. Reinforced steel. Interior latch. Then he wired a secondary alert system tied to the shed door, a physical sensor hidden beneath the threshold, connected to a modified doorbell that would chime 3 short beeps into his bedroom if triggered. 3 nights passed without incident. Then the package arrived. It came with no postage, no markings, just a cardboard box taped crudely at the seams and left on his front steps sometime between midnight and dawn. Inside was raw meat, gray, bloodless, unnaturally cold. Buried in the center was a thick clump of black dog hair twisted with white powder. Barlo sniffed it once, growled, and backed away. Nicholas didn't hesitate. He closed the box, gloved up, and placed it in a freezer in his shop reserved for curing epoxy resins. Then he made 3 calls: Alice, the vet, and the county sheriff's office. This time, he didn't want any interpretation. He wanted action. The deputy who came out was older, grizzled, and clearly more familiar with rural disputes. He didn't try to soften it. "This looks like baiting," he said. "Animal cruelty with a clear target, and whoever left it knew what they were doing. This wasn't a scare tactic. This was a test." "For what?" Nicholas asked. The deputy looked him square in the face. "To see if you'd escalate." Nicholas didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was written in the way he stood, in the way his jaw tightened, in the way Barlo pressed against his leg like a second shadow. That weekend, someone painted his front gate. Not graffiti. Words. 2 of them. Sick dog. Sick owner. The paint was red, dried in drips like someone had slashed the metal instead of writing on it. Nicholas didn't clean it. He took photos, then removed the gate entirely and replaced it with a reinforced panel he had stored for years. A custom piece, once intended for a client who never paid. Heavy, imposing, bare steel with riveted seams. No paint, no handle, just mass. The next day, Karen filed another complaint, this time with the local zoning board, claiming the new gate violated visual codes, created an oppressive presence, and disrupted the harmony of the street. Nicholas didn't attend the hearing. Alice did, and she brought with her the restraining order, the footage, the audio recording of the earlier phone call from the fake inspector, and the veterinary report. By the end of the day, the zoning board dismissed the complaint and issued a formal statement that any further reports from the same individual would require physical corroboration. It was a rare win in a world where procedural nonsense often outpaced truth, but it came at a cost. That night, Nicholas found the boundary post on the eastern ridge torched. It hadn't burned long, just enough to blacken the steel and char the surrounding grass. It was meant to be symbolic. A warning, not destruction. A message in fire. Nicholas stood before the scorched metal, the wind pushing smoke into his coat, and he thought, not for the first time, about what it meant to own something. Not just land, not just a house, but your space, your life, your right to exist without being touched by other people's rot. He went back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time since it began, he picked up the old rotary phone he kept for emergencies. The number he dialed wasn't written anywhere. It wasn't stored in his cell. It lived only in his memory. The man who answered spoke like he expected the call. "Brady," he said, "didn't think I'd hear from you again." Nicholas replied, voice steady. "I'm not asking for trouble," he said. "I'm asking for proof." "Of what?" Nicholas looked out the window where Barlo sat, silent, watching the dark. "Of who sent the fire." The call didn't bring solutions. It never did. What it brought was movement. Quiet, fast, invisible movement. The kind of behind-the-scenes traction Nicholas hadn't needed in nearly 2 decades. When he'd left that world behind, he left it for good, or so he thought. But when your name still carried enough weight among the right kind of men, sometimes it was less about asking favors and more about reminding them you still had a pulse. Within 48 hours, a man appeared at the edge of Nicholas's property, not on the land, just outside the tree line. Dressed in civilian gray, sunglasses, and an unbranded ball cap, he gave one brief nod toward the house before turning and walking away. 15 minutes later, Nicholas found a USB drive in his mailbox. No note, no demands. Just the truth packaged in silence. The footage on the drive was grainy, but serviceable. Infrared trail cams from a hunting post somewhere on the far end of the woods, a place Nicholas didn't monitor because it backed onto an unmarked fire road no one was supposed to use. The timestamp showed 2:38 a.m., the night the boundary marker had been torched. A single figure, hooded, carrying a small fuel canister and a bundle of cloth. The moment the fire caught, the person turned toward the camera just slightly, enough for a partial facial profile. It was a young man, maybe early 20s. Not Karen. Not anyone from the neighborhood Nicholas recognized. But there was something in the shape of the mouth, the eyes, the posture, resemblance. That told its own story. He cross-referenced the image with a copy of the zoning complaint. Karen had included her name on that one, but also listed a co-signer, Evan Ellington, her nephew. Nicholas didn't contact the police. Not yet. He contacted Alice. She processed it all within minutes. "We have enough now," she said. "Enough to push for criminal charges. The arson won't go away. That's jail time." "I'm not interested in court," Nicholas said. "I want her to stop. For good." "She won't," Alice replied, "unless the court makes her. She's not wired for accountability. People like her don't stop until someone else draws the line." Nicholas nodded slowly, then told her what he planned to do. It wasn't legal advice he needed anymore. It was clearance. Later that evening, he began prepping the property. Not for attack, for confrontation. He didn't want violence and he wasn't going to initiate it, but he knew it was coming. People like Karen, when cornered, didn't retreat. They performed. And he was going to give her a stage where she'd be her own downfall. He reinstalled the motion lights, calibrated to a new pattern that would flood the perimeter without delay. He mounted 2 additional cameras, one at roof level, one hidden near the main gate, both running independently from his usual power grid. He placed signs, clear and legal, stating the presence of surveillance and warning of trespass laws. Then he waited. It didn't take long. 3 nights later, the sensors pinged just after midnight. This time, there were 2 of them. Nicholas didn't move immediately. He watched from inside as the pair approached the gate. One held a crowbar, the other something that looked like a duffel bag. They were calm, methodical, not rushing, not amateurs. They cut the outer padlock with bolt cutters, then slipped inside like it was their own backyard. Nicholas stepped out onto the porch slowly, shotgun slung but pointed down. He didn't say a word. The floodlights hit them a second later. The 2 men froze, caught in the sudden glare like deer in a trap. Nicholas took 3 steps forward, slowly, with Barlo beside him. The old dog didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just stared, body low, ready. The man with the bag dropped it and raised his hands. "We're just here to talk," he called. "Try again," Nicholas replied. "It's about the property lines. There's been a misunderstanding." Nicholas's finger moved to the safety. He didn't disengage it, but they heard the shift. "Step back, to the fence. Leave the tools. Leave the bag." They hesitated, then complied. Nicholas followed them to the gate, then kicked the bag open with his boot. Inside were stakes, rope, and what looked like a homemade smoke canister. "You planning to mark my land with pyrotechnics?" "It's just symbolism," the younger one said. Karen said, "Stop." The floodlight hit them again as they stepped outside the gate. Nicholas stayed inside the property line. "If she sends anyone else here," he said slowly, clearly, "you won't walk out. Not because I'll stop you, because the law will." One of them opened his mouth. Nicholas raised the shotgun a fraction, not aimed, but enough to clarify the next move wouldn't be verbal. They ran. He watched them disappear down the road, then locked the gate and sat in silence. At dawn, he delivered the footage and the canister contents to Alice, who filed a criminal trespass motion with direct photographic evidence. This time, it went to the sheriff's office and bypassed the usual civil complaint process. By noon, deputies were knocking on Karen's door. By evening, her nephew had been detained on suspicion of attempted arson and conspiracy to commit property damage. Karen herself didn't come out of the house that day. The silence around her residence spread like a sickness. Curtains drawn, blinds closed, the mailbox untouched. Neighbors who had once kept quiet began asking questions. Others sent messages. One even left a pie at Nicholas's gate with a note that read simply, "Thank you." It wasn't gratitude that mattered to him. It was quiet. And for the first time in weeks, it felt like it might last. The following week moved like the tail end of a storm, slow, heavy, and uncertain. There were no more intrusions, no more flyers, no more packages on the doorstep or painted threats on the gate. For the first time in nearly a month, Nicholas could walk his property without wondering what was hiding just beyond the tree line. He still walked it, every morning and every night, but now it was out of habit, not fear. Barlo had returned to his old self, mostly. The limp was permanent now, more pronounced than before, but his posture had changed. He stayed closer to the house, but not because he was afraid. He was guarding. He watched everything. Karen's house remained sealed behind silence. Her car didn't move. Her porch light stayed off. Rumor had it she'd been advised by counsel to stay indoors until charges were settled, that her nephew's arrest had revealed connections to 2 other complaints in nearby neighborhoods, and that an investigation into misuse of community funds was now quietly underway. Nicholas didn't care. He didn't need to know the details. What mattered was that she was done. Not legally, not yet, but operationally. Her reach had been cut off at the wrist. The county sheriff had made a personal visit 2 days after the arrest. Not an interrogation, not a lecture. Just a man in uniform who stood at Nicholas's gate and said, "You did everything right. I wish everyone handled things the way you did." Nicholas didn't say much in return. He nodded. That was enough. Alice called the next day with the final word on the restraining order. It had been extended indefinitely, citing documented patterns of escalation, physical danger to property and animal, and intent to deceive through multiple channels. Karen was barred from approaching within 300 feet of Nicholas's home, business, or any parcel of land in his name. Her legal team had agreed to a settlement in exchange for avoiding formal criminal trial, with fines paid, public records sealed under a no-contest plea. It was over, quietly, legally, completely. And yet, Nicholas didn't feel victorious. He felt steady. He spent the next weekend rebuilding what had been damaged. Not just the structures, but the rhythm of life itself. He replaced the scorched post with a new one, carved by hand, engraved with the word "boundary" down its length. He restored the gate, sanded the steel, and bolted it without ceremony. The motion sensors stayed. The cameras stayed. But the alarm wiring was disconnected. He didn't need it anymore. Not because there were no threats left, but because he wasn't interested in watching shadows for the rest of his life. One evening, as the sun dropped low behind the ridge, Nicholas took a chair to the porch. Barlo rested beside him, head on his boot. The trees were still. The air was clean. And for the first time in what felt like years, there was no weight pressing behind his ribs. No noise at the edges. Just silence. The kind that didn't need to be earned or protected. The kind that simply existed. A few neighbors passed by over the following days. Some waved. Some stopped. A man he barely knew from 3 lots up brought over a box of fence post brackets he claimed were extras from an old project. "Figured you'd put them to better use than I ever did." Another left a loaf of bread wrapped in butcher's paper. No note, just initials scratched into the outside. Even the ones who said nothing said it all with how they walked now, more slowly past his gate, with eyes that didn't carry suspicion or wariness. Respect, perhaps, or maybe just awareness. They knew who held the line when no one else would. Nicholas didn't throw a party. He didn't give interviews or post videos. He simply lived. The shop reopened the following Monday. Orders picked up. Routine returned. And so did he. That winter, Nicholas replaced the porch railing, not because it needed fixing, but because he wanted something new in its place. A symbol. He crafted it from black walnut, smooth and dense with a single inlay down the center in dark brass that spelled out 5 words. No one crosses this line. He didn't expect visitors to ask about it, but if they ever did, he'd simply point to the horizon and say, "That's not a warning, that's a truth." And that was enough.